The story begins with Hinagi telling Yukito that she was dating somebody else. What a great way to start this story, right? Yukito mustered all his courage to speak to the love of his life, Suzurikawa Hinagi, determined to confess his love. With a stiff posture, he told her they've known each other since childhood, and she has always been special to him. However, after being dumped, Yukito suddenly clenched his fist and ran away without warning, leaving Hinagi dumbfounded. As he kept running, memories of Hinagi flashed in his mind. He always thought their feelings were mutual, and now, after hearing the harsh truth, nothing made sense anymore. With tears on his cheeks, Yukito wished to disappear. Shoyu High School Year 1 Class B. That was the class Yukito was in. It was the first day of school, which meant it was time for introductions, the most crucial day of Yukito's life. A girl named Sakurai Kana was called, introducing herself enthusiastically. As Yukito perceived the girl as the sunny type, he was also deciding on which personality he should showcase for his introduction. Next, a girl named Shakadu Anya sprung from her seat, randomly sharing that she liked bugs. Weird flex, but okay. As Yukito thought this girl was a bit gloomy, he was also contemplating where he should make a low-key or unforgettable debut. Finally, this raging sociopath of an MC had decided he wouldn't take a big risk. He will be the average, harmless, and gloomy character. He will go with the forgettable yet easy-to-go-by persona. Bro's trying to be different so hard, it's just cringe. When it was finally his turn to introduce himself, Yukito wasted no time to deliver his nonchalant speech. Just then, he thanked everyone for taking care of him because now, he was gonna quit school. Everyone was left with their mouths gaping wide, unable to process what the class weirdo just said. Yukito realized he wasn't as forgettable as he had hoped, and now everyone thought of him as an oddball. Instead of being embarrassed, he was rather understanding, accepting the fact that what he did was actually weird. At least this guy is self-aware. The teacher, who called him by his last name, Kokonoe, asked what the hell just happened. Yukito simply shrugged, apologizing for his one-of-a-kind introduction. He claimed that the word was unreasonable, leading him to think that going to school was pointless. Although confused, the teacher was left with no choice but to accept the young man's point of view. Despite the banger intro, Yukito wasn't done. He continued speaking, introducing his full name and his goal of being the gloomy guy who was always alone. On most days, he would pretend to be asleep so he would appreciate it if everyone treated him like he didn't exist. He wouldn't even mind if everyone verbally attacked him, saying things like he was disgusting and undiagnosed with a mental health disorder. Well, that won't even matter because Yukito was convinced that no one would want to talk to a gloomy character like him. Everybody was too stunned to speak, making Yukito think he had done a good job. Definitely no one would talk to him now. However, the teacher, Fujishiro, suddenly exclaimed that he shouldn't waste his high school life like that, as she was more than willing to lend him a hand. Yukito thought the teacher was overly nice and he refused her offer. He also reassured her that his high school life wasn't the only thing he had wasted. Fujishiro was surprised, and she was slightly creeped out by the young man's realistic mindset. She then told him to sit down, noting that she was now aware of Yukito being a problem child. The rest of the class burst into laughter while Yukito argued that he was just being modest. This made Fujishiro laugh harder, leaving Yukito confused. His introduction was totally normal. He tried asking his seatmate for validation, but the latter only replied that whatever that was, the school year would definitely be fun with him around. Yukito's seatmate called him by his first name and handed him his phone, asking to exchange contacts. Yukito, on the other hand, was surprised to be treated so casually. He called his seatmate Tanaka, who then called him out because he had just introduced himself as Mihu Kuki. Yukito apologized for his mistake, reasoning that he wasn't listening. However, a more important matter crossed his mind. Why the heck was this guy even talking to a gloomy person like him? Yukito flashed this question to Mihu, and he replied that he was rather unique than gloomy. Mihu didn't care. He just wanted to become friends with Yukito. However, at the back of Yukito's mind, he believes that Mihu just wanted him to be his errand boy. By placing a gloomy guy like him on Mihu's side, his handsomeness will shine more. But on the bright side, a self-centered guy was easier to deal with than someone who had a poker face. Mihu, noticing that Yukito was internally pissed, noted that he looked like he was cursing him in his mind. Just then, Yukito pulled out some cash from his wallet, asking if a friend's task was to give money. Surprised by his understanding of friendship, Mihu asked him what traumatic experience he had in the past. This guy totally needs to touch grass. Mihu told Yukito to close his wallet and the latter obliged, suddenly becoming docile. Despite being weirded out, Mihu flashed a smile, noting that he would be in Yukito's care from now on. He then asked Yukito if he was free after school. Just then, Sakurai Kana suggested that they do karaoke since they are all classmates now. She then asked Yukito if he wanted to come, making him overthink the whole situation. They were finally at the point where they would gather as classmates to get to know each other better. Yukito thought that Sakurai-kana was the sunniest of the sunny characters, which would mean that she was his strongest rival. He knew he'd have to deal with this problem, so he immediately came up with a strategy. With a demure gesture, he claimed that Sakurai was a queen, and he insisted on calling her Elizabeth. This left the girl confused as her name was far from what Yukito was suggesting. Just then, Yukito expressed his disbelief at being invited, so Sakurai explained that Mihu vouched for him, claiming that he wasn't weird. Hearing this, Yukito gazed at the other students who were going, and he saw a mix of hesitant and excited faces. Just then, he slammed his palms on the desk, apologizing to Sakurai for not being able to come. He reasoned that he had something to tend to, leaving Sakurai no choice but to respect his wishes. As Yukito made his way to the door, Sakurai yelled that she would love for him to come next time. As Yukito left, he thought that he wasn't exactly lying because he really had to go home and make dinner for his mother. On top of that, hanging around with those girls was just a disaster waiting to happen. He thought about Suzurikawa Hinagi and how she was in a relationship. He wouldn't want to be the one to cause any issues. Imagine joining a most delusional contest and you're up against this guy. Then there's Kamishiro Shiori, the most innocent person Yukito has ever seen. Being with her just seemed off, and it looked like she was uncomfortable whenever he was around. Yukito was sure that those two girls were bothered by his presence. That was why, when he saw their names in the name list, he vowed to stay away from them. However, fate had a different plan, and they were ironically put in the same class. Elsewhere, the rest of the class had a blast in the karaoke bar. Their conversation shifted to Yukito, and they wondered what his deal was. One of the guys claimed he was bad news as no one would quit school on their first day. Just then, Mihu joined the conversation saying that Yukito was just an interesting guy. When asked about his relationship with Yukito, Mihu explained that they used to play basketball in middle school, but they were on opposite teams and doubted that he still remembered. Curious, Kamishiro Shiori asked if Mihu ever had a match with Yukito back in middle school, and he confirmed it. Mihu was surprised that Kamishiro knew about this, so he asked if she knew why he didn't show up at the tournament. Just then, Kamishiro abruptly shifted her gaze, saying that she couldn't talk about it. Overhearing the gossip, one of the girls asked if she was good friends with Yukito, but she said it was the opposite. She was certain that Yukito hated her. Back in the summer of their second year, Kamishiro had a major interest in Yukito. Their club wasn't that committed to their activities, so the girls and boys took it upon themselves to have fun. Kamishiro joined in, but Yukito caught her eye. It was like he was possessed, and he kept shooting the ball with utmost determination. It was as if he was trying to prove or forget something. Yukito's efforts summoned the passion and commitment the club never had, and with him, they could have aimed for a high spot at the tournament. Because of that, the club got fired up. Back then, Kamishiro thought of him as the greatest person ever. He was able to change and influence people by just being himself. However, he never took care of himself, so she took the role. Soon enough, she noticed that she was falling for him. But she was just a kid back then, and she couldn't be honest with her feelings. Because of that, she confessed to him despite being unsure. Being immature, she ended up betraying him in the most hideous way. Bro, this girl needs a trip to the psych ward. Looking back at it now, Kamishiro was sure that she caused Yukito's oddness. Suddenly, Kamishiro unexpectedly gazed into Hinagi's eyes, causing her to get defensive. Hinagi stood from her seat, angrily saying that she was hearing things. She asked Kamishiro to repeat her story, but the latter wasn't buying it. She interrogated Hinagi for her hostile reaction, demanding to know what was up between her and Yukito. Two of the girls in the group were quick to pick up on the tense atmosphere. The place was suddenly turning into an arena, which didn't make sense because Kamishiro and Hinagi were supposed to be friends because they came from the same middle school. Just then, Hinagi shared that she was Kamishiro's childhood friend. Kamishiro furiously asked if she caused Yukito to change, and Hinagi regrettably admitted it. However, she suddenly got enraged, asking Kamishiro to disclose what she actually did to Yukito. As the situation escalated, Sakurai stepped in, pulling the girls apart before they decided to tear each other's faces. She reminded the girls that they were in a get-together, so they should be getting along. The others, feeling trapped in the moment, just tried smiling to hide their awkwardness. Just then, Hinagi took her bag and headed to the door, claiming that she was leaving. Meanwhile, Kamishiro apologized for ruining the moment, and she excused herself to go home. After the two left, the rest of the group was finally able to breathe. To feel better, they urged the guy named Kazunari to start singing, and he immediately got into action. Mihu, on the other hand, was still baffled by Yukito's backstory. That night, Yukito was on the hot seat for his unhinged introduction. His sister Yuri was furious because of what he did. He couldn't even go ahead and eat dinner because Yuri was busy interrogating him. This led Yukito to believe that someone was spying on him because word of his outrageous introduction reached her ears. As Yukito took a bite of his dry food, Yuri suddenly asked if he purposely embarrassed himself to avoid Hinagi and Kamishiro. However, Yukito sighed, merely saying that he had no comments. Yuri suddenly gave him a death stare, causing Yukito to admit the truth. He knew his sister heard about Hinagi, his childhood friend, but it turned out that she also knew Kamishiro. Suddenly, Yukito stood from his seat, claiming that he had to go study. Sensing he was upset, Yuki asked if he was okay. Yukito said he was fine and then went straight to his room. As he plopped on his bed, he felt bad for being rude to his sister. Could it be that she actually cared about him? That would be impossible because Yuri hated his guts. Meanwhile, Yuri slammed her fist on the table, angrily asking why Yukito was always the one suffering. She wanted her brother to have a bright high school life, but nothing changed at all. Both Suzurikawa Hinagi and Kamishiro Shiori were useless little rats in her eyes, and for that she will never forgive them. Based on the look on her brother's face, Yuki was sure that Yukito still hated her. He would never speak to her unless it was for practical reasons, and she knew this wasn't a normal sibling dynamic. But she couldn't blame him because she caused it in the first place. Ever since that fateful day, he never called her his sister ever again. Yuki slowly wrapped her arms around herself for comfort, accepting the fact that Yukito would always hate her. Even so, she will protect him from Kamishiro and Hinagi. The next day at school, Kamishiro and Hinagi tried catching Yukito's attention. Kamishiro asked if he was joining the basketball club, and then she mentioned that he was planning to become the club's manager. Hinagi, on the other hand, asked Yukito if he wanted to have lunch with her in the cafeteria. Yukito was more confused than ever, making him ask God why he kept sending him trials. Yukito had always been unlucky with women. His own mother neglected him, his sister hated him, his childhood friends who he assumed liked him had a boyfriend right before his confession, and he got bullied during his heartbreak phase. All his troubles stacked up, and the most obvious one was his relationship with women. With all his dilemma, Yukito theorized that he must have been a reincarnator from another world who got killed after defying evil. After that, he was born into this world with bad karma. Maybe that was why he couldn't build deep bonds with people and he couldn't even show empathy towards them. It was all too overwhelming, so he gave up on even trying to understand why. But right now, it seemed like the whole world had turned upside down. Why the heck were Hinagi and Kamishiro fighting over him? Kamishiro asked Hinagi if she could talk to Yukito later, as she was the first to speak to him. However, Hinagi stood her ground, suggesting that she spoke with Yukito after they had lunch. As the girls bickered, Yukito was caught in a crisis because he didn't even want to talk to either of them. He only wanted to be left alone, and he could only wish these girls would fight somewhere else. Just then, Mihu asked Yukito which club he planned to join. The girls suddenly fell silent while Yukito flashed a frustrated look at Mihu, pointing out how his question just made the situation worse. Kamishiro suddenly appeared before Yukito, urging him to join the basketball team. She will be the manager, and this time she will commit to the role. Thinking about basketball brought back a lot of bad memories for Yukito. He gave his all, but what he got in return was disappointment. He didn't even reach his goals, and he got nothing out of it. Because of this, he bluntly told Kamishiro that he no longer played basketball. However, Kamishiro remained relentless, refusing to accept his answer. Afraid that Yukito's mind was made up, she slammed her hands on his desk, reminding him that he tried so hard. Just then, Yukito told her she knew what happened best after he poured all his effort. This comment made Kamishiro cry, and she mustered all her courage to say a cohesive response. Yukito coldly asked her how long she was going to pity him, making her feel worse. As Kamishiro panicked, Yukito suddenly concluded the pity party, casually declaring that he didn't have plans to join the club anyway. He was a gloomy guy and his only club option was to go home. Disappointed, Mihu urged Yukito to reconsider, but his mind was made up. Just then, Yukito headed to the door, informing everyone that he was going to the cafeteria. Kamishiro called him, but Yukito didn't give her time to explain and only wished her luck in being the manager. Kamishiro noticed the coldness in his voice as he no longer called her name like he used to. "Girl, do you still expect to be called Sugar Pie Honey Bunch?" As Yukito headed for the cafeteria, he noticed that the baseball club was still having afternoon practices. He used to practice like crazy back then, but now he felt nothing when he touched the ball. He just lost the energy for it, and he believed he would never play like he used to. However, there was no point in dwelling on the past, so he pulled himself together and continued walking. When he returned to the classroom, Hinagi suddenly approached him, asking if he wanted to eat with her. She was down for a hunger strike if it meant eating with this nerd. Yukito was dumbfounded, and he couldn't believe that she was waiting for him to come back. Just then he burst Hinagi's bubble, bluntly telling her that she should stop talking to him. Hinagi stuttered, reminding him that they were classmates and childhood friends. However, this didn't count to Yukito, and he claimed it was all in the past. When Hinagi asked him why he would say this, Yukito coldly replied that he would feel bad for her boyfriend. Yukito's words hit Hinagi like a bolt of lightning, drawing the attention of everyone around them. Her middle school boyfriend was well known, and exposing that part of her past in front of their classmates was like tearing open an old wound. Hinagi was on the verge of tears, and she asked Yukito to just forget about the past. However, Yukito replied that he was only being mindful, as he wouldn't want his girlfriend to be chummy with another girl. They were childhood friends, so tension was to be expected. Hinagi tried explaining, but Yukito reminded her that he had to distance himself when she had a boyfriend. He didn't understand why Hinagi struggled to get the idea. Yes, they were childhood friends, but this didn't mean they could be together forever. Just then, Yukito decided to leave, coldly telling Hinagi to have lunch with someone else. As he walked away, he was reminded of how he let her go because he wished her the best. Now he was left wondering if he still felt the same way about her. As soon as Yukito walked out, murmurs filled the classroom. Some students groaned in disappointment, lamenting their lost chances with Hinagi, while others shrugged. After all, someone as stunning as her was bound to be taken. When one of them curiously asked who the lucky guy was, another eagerly leaned in, ready to spill the secret. But before the words could leave their lips, Hinagi snapped. Her voice cut through the chatter like a blade, demanding everyone to shut up. Silence fell as she trembled, her expression crumbling. Then without warning, tears welled up in her eyes. Her voice broke as she choked out that everything was her fault. Later that day, the teacher announced that the class would be having an outdoor lesson the next day, an annual event designed to strengthen friendships through a hiking trip. As soon as the teacher instructed them to form groups of 4, the room buzzed with excitement. Yukito, however, let out an exhausted sigh, already predicting the outcome. As expected, everyone quickly paired off, leaving him untouched like an unwanted dirty sock. The teacher, now practically begging someone to take him in, scanned the room for volunteers. Most people would have been mortified by the rejection, but Yukito only leaned back in satisfaction. If anything, this was proof that his brooding lone wolf persona was finally taking effect. However, before Yukito could fully revel in his success, Mihu suddenly appeared before him, flashing a charming smile that could make panties drop. Without hesitation, Mihu declared that he wanted to team up with Yukito, leaving the latter momentarily dazed by the sheer power of Mihu's lethal face card. Yukito quickly snapped out of it and attempted to push Mihu away, casually insisting that someone as bright and cheerful as him shouldn't be grouping up with equally sunny people. Mihu, of course, wasn't having it, and the two soon found themselves in a back-and-forth argument. Unbeknownst to them, 2 figures loomed behind them, listening intently. Hinagi and Kamishiro, seemingly unfazed by the ongoing bickering, had already made up their minds. They were forcing their way into this group whether Yukito liked it or not. The following day, the class arrived at their destination. As soon as they got off the bus, Yukito strayed away from the group, leaving Mihu confused. Just then, he called out to the mountains, saying, "Tartarus!" Everybody was weirded out by Yukito's randomness, while Mihu commented that he could never top his friend's humor. Suddenly, Hinagi and Kamishiro appeared, forcing Yukito to keep his distance. Later on, the hike began, and Yukito made sure that he never interacted with the girls. Mihu tried to ease the awkwardness by speaking to him, but Yukito barely replied. Yukito suddenly gazed at the girls, wondering why they paired up with him when they could have just teamed up with their friends. He started to worry, thinking that he would ruin their high school lives. Just then, Hinagi accidentally sprained her ankle, forcing everyone to take a break. Yukito approached her, ambiguously telling her to take them off. Everyone was shocked by his command, especially Hinagi, who refused to do it in public. She held onto her jacket, bashfully telling Yukito that they should do the intimate act when they were all alone. Confused, Yukito asked her what she was yapping about, as he only wanted to see her injured feet. Hinagi quickly showed him her foot, and it was all swollen. Yukito apologized for their fast pacing, but Hinagi argued that it wasn't his fault. She then apologized for slowing them down, but Kamishiro reassured her not to worry about it. Suddenly, Hinagi flinched, obviously worried about something. Before Yukito could say anything, she defensively said that her feet didn't smell. Yukito said she would be offended if he told her that, which made Hinagi more paranoid. Trying to make her more comfortable, Yukito suggested pinching his nose so he didn't have to smell anything, but this only made the situation worse. Bro totally lacked social awareness. Yukito had had enough of Hinagi's drama, so he insisted on smelling her foot to prove that it didn't stink. Hinagi squirmed, but Yukito was a determined sniffer. Of course, they had to draw this panel. As Hinagi kept screaming, Yukito accepted his fate. Everyone will accuse him as the guy with a foot fetish, so he would just turn himself in. Shortly after, Yukito bandaged Hinagi's feet. She tried standing, while Yukito asked her if they were too tight. When she confirmed that it was just right, Yukito handed her a bottle of water, reassuring her that they would now go at a slower pace. However, before they could resume their hike, their teacher suddenly clutched onto Yukito's arm, asking him to bandage her feet too. Seeing the exhaustion on her face, Yukito could only say that she looked like a brain-dead zombie. Sensing that she got tired easily, Yukito told her that she will definitely get into trouble on one of her kids' sports festival. The teacher was offended as she wasn't even married yet. Just then, Yukito called Kamishiro, telling her to help the teacher while he instructed her. He reminded her about her plans to be the manager of the basketball team, so this would surely be a helpful skill. Kamishiro quickly jumped into action, following Yukito's instructions. Soon after, the task was done, and Kamishiro proudly asked Yukito for praise. However, Yukito was weirded out, as she looked like a dog begging for a stroll. Oddly enough, he tossed a piece of candy into the distance and Kamishiro immediately ran off to fetch it. Yukito didn't expect her to listen, but she came back with the candy in hand, asking for a little pat on the head. Riz so good he became Dr. Dolittle. Frustrated, Yukito reminded Kamishiro that she was not a dog, but a human. She furiously replied that he told her to follow his command, and she only complied. Having enough of this nonsense, Yukito exclaimed that if she were to act like a dog, then he would act like a breeder in response. A what now? Suddenly, Yukito patted Kamishiro much to her delight. However, he started rubbing her belly like an actual dog, making Kamishiro ticklish and uncomfortable. She tried to fight her way out of his clutches, bashfully telling Yukito, "Just the head." When he didn't listen, Kamishiro screamed that this wasn't what she expected, all while looking like she had just reached the pinnacle of pleasure. At this point, I'm out of commentaries. With Kamishiro lying motionless on the ground, Yukito asked her if she now remembered that she was human. Kamishiro slowly said she was, but then she rolled over to face him, reminding him not to do this to anyone else because he would get into trouble for forcing intimacy. Yukito was confused, as he had already committed a violation by doing it to her. He wondered if it was better to remain oblivious, but Kamishiro told him it was bad either way. Suddenly, Kamishiro realized how funny the situation was, and she burst into laughter. She noticed how it started to feel like last year when they were still close. Just then, she touched Yukito's arm, asking him if it felt okay now. He replied that it was, and that she didn't have to worry about it. However, Kamishiro never got over her guilt, and she worriedly admitted that she couldn't do what he asked. Upon seeing her face, Yukito felt guilty as well, realizing that Kamishiro would forgive him for anything he did to make up for her faults. Just then, Mihu called out to them, informing them that it was time to go. As Yukito walked away, he thought about the situation between him and Kamishiro. It seemed like they were frozen in time, unable to go forward. Later on, the group arrived at their final destination in the middle of the woods. The girls were amazed by the view, while Yukito contemplated if he truly was impressed. Mihu, on the other hand, only cared about eating. When it was finally time for lunch, Yukito grabbed his waterproof sheet and the group thanked him for being the resident Doraemon. After eating, Yukito asked Hinagi if her feet were okay, and she confirmed they were. She didn't expect to feel better right away, and she was just amazed by the bandage's effectiveness. Just then, Yukito offered her some candies and bandages, making Hinagi wonder why he was so prepared for injuries. She then remembered what had happened to him in middle school, and it all made sense. Yukito was shocked that she knew about this, so Hinagi revealed to him that she was always watching him. Okay, creep. While Yukito wondered why she did this, Hinagi asked why he helped her, to which he simply replied that they were classmates. Hinagi seemed disappointed with his response, but she tried keeping a calm exterior. Suddenly, Yukito noticed the bear keychain attached to her phone, and he was surprised that she still had it. Dazed by what he just said, Hinagi's eyes sparkled as she realized Yukito still remembered. He replied that it was from the festival, and Hinagi confirmed it. She then held the little bear close to her chest, saying that she had fun back then. Suddenly, Yukito started talking about Hinagi's relationship, asking if she had a fight with her boyfriend. She tried answering his question, but she couldn't continue. She then asked him what to do if he hurt someone else's feelings, and Yukito quickly replied that he would apologize. However, Hinagi shook her head, arguing that she would never be forgiven. Hearing this, Yukito suggested they could just start over, which confused Hinagi. Yukito elaborated, saying that if she could still fix it, she should try starting anew with her boyfriend. Hinagi had a moment of enlightenment, and she thanked him as she stood up. Suddenly, she faced Yukito with her head bowed, asking him for forgiveness for all the mean things she had said to him. She bowed even more, admitting she was afraid that they wouldn't be able to go back to what they once were. She was beyond terrified that they wouldn't be together anymore. She also admitted that asking for forgiveness was easy, as she couldn't just tell Yukito to forget about everything. Yukito tried easing his way into the conversation, but Hinagi kept talking, admitting that she was unreasonable, arrogant, and selfish. However, it didn't change the fact that she was sorry. Her voice echoed throughout the crowd, making everyone gaze towards them. Just then, Yukito said that he didn't remember her saying anything mean, which shocked Hinagi. Sensing her confusion, Yukito explained that he should be sorry for exposing her boyfriend. He was more than thankful that she wanted to make amends. He then added that he only needed to get the pain out of his system, which explained his actions. Hinagi frantically asked why he was apologizing, as she was clearly in the wrong back then. Yet Yukito remained calm, his expression unreadable as he acknowledged that everything she had said back then was true, even if it had been harsh. He had come to understand his place in her life. With a gentle smile, he reassured her that the distance between them wasn't about his feelings being unreturned, but simply the result of choosing different paths. He knew Hinagi had a kind heart, which was why it pained him to see her crying before him. Since when did this dude become Gandhi? Hinagi was important to Yukito, and this was why he could only pray for her happiness from a distance. He knew he had lost his worth as a childhood friend, and they were nothing more than classmates. Later that day, the class boarded the school bus, ready to head home. Just as Hinagi was about to step on, she suddenly froze, rummaging frantically through her bag. Her expression grew tense as she realized something was missing. Kamishiro noticed and asked what was wrong, but Hinagi didn't respond. Instead, her eyes fixated on the string attached to her phone. The small bear keychain was gone. Before she could run off to find it, Yukito grabbed her wrist, reminding her that the bus was about to leave. She protested, insisting that the keychain was important because he had given it to her. But Yukito remained unmoved, telling her that her boyfriend could easily replace it with as many as she wanted. That was the last straw. Hinagi snapped, her frustration boiling over as she yelled that she had had enough of this. Yukito was taken aback, realizing just how much the keychain meant to her. Despite everything, he couldn't just leave her like this. Moments later, Hinagi sat on the bus, gripping the string that once held the bear. Her mind raced. Was this punishment for trying to mend things with Yukito? If so, it felt cruel. That little charm wasn't just an accessory. It was proof of all the time they had spent together, the last gift he had ever given her. She knew she could ask him for another one, but it wouldn't be the same. Staring out the window, she felt torn. Should she go back and search for it? The thought gnawed at her, but deep down she knew she couldn't, not with her injury holding her back. All she could do was sit there trembling as the bus pulled away. Later at school, the teacher asked some of the students where Yukito was. One of them replied that he felt unwell and went home, making the teacher skeptical because the young man didn't inform her beforehand. The teacher asked Mihu if this were true, but he merely said he didn't know. Hearing the whole class fuss about Yukito, Hinagi could only feel worried. Unbeknownst to everyone, Yukito went back to the forest, declaring that he was back. He sighed, knowing he couldn't ignore Hinagi's whiny face. As he started his search, he promised himself that he would only go on one round, and after that he'd give up. Hinagi laid on her bed, staring at her phone with a heavy heart, murmuring to herself that there was no way to restore what she had with Yukito. Their families used to attend festivals together, but over time it had just been the two of them. She remembered one particular night when Yukito had reached for her hand, but she had instinctively pulled away, embarrassed by how sweaty her palm was. She had tried to discreetly wipe it dry, hoping he wouldn't notice, but he never tried to hold her hand again. Welp, there goes her chances. Now she couldn't help but wonder, if she had just let him hold her hand that day, would things have turned out differently? Would they have continued spending time together, maybe even holding hands without hesitation? Would they have kissed, walked home together, and become something more? But now, all she could do was wonder. She couldn't really ask him why because she was to blame for everything. She destroyed their bond. Yukito finally tracked down the bear, though night had already fallen, and he had nearly given up hope of finding it. Sweaty and covered in dirt, he gave himself credit for the discovery, despite his doubts. Holding the bear in his hands, he wondered how long Hinagi would cherish it. He had already discarded everything she had ever given him, both objects and memories alike. Brushing the thought aside, he decided to head home. But before he could take a step, he suddenly lost his footing and tumbled down the hill. As he plummeted, he accepted that this was the end. In his mind, he silently bid farewell to his mother, his sister, Hinagi, Kamishiro, and even Mihu. What a drama queen. It dawned on him that he had only known a handful of people in his life, yet somehow that felt like enough. And so, embracing his fate, Yukito let out a scream as he fell. Back during the festival, Hinagi eagerly dragged Yukito along to get some plum candy with her. He knew that apple candy was her favorite, but she claimed she didn't want to open her mouth too much. So they settled for plum candy, enjoying the moment like carefree kids. After that, Hinagi insisted he play a shooting game to win her a bear keychain. To him, the bear looked ugly, but he tried to win it for her anyway, simply because she seemed happy. By middle school, Hinagi had become even more frustrating. Yet Yukito still held on to the hope that they would return to the festival together the following summer. Seeing her smile as she clutched the bear, he was convinced that their bond would only grow stronger. Just as Hinagi was about to tell Yukito something, a burst of fireworks lit up the sky, drowning out her words. She had just started talking about plans for the next year when a group of overly excited boys accidentally bumped into her mid-sentence. Reacting quickly, Yukito grabbed her hand to keep her from falling, but to his shock, she immediately swatted it away. She hastily wiped her sweaty palms, but the damage was done. Yukito was already fixated on the rejection, realizing at that moment that things between them would never be the same. That slap wasn't just a reflex, it was a rejection. The next morning, Yukito woke up in bed, his body aching from a cold. At some point, he had managed to make it home, only to collapse in the rain. As he glanced at the clock, he realized he had been asleep for over half a day. He vaguely recalled having a nostalgic dream, though he couldn't tell if it had been happy or sad. All that was left was the unmistakable feeling of loss. His gaze then drifted to the bear sitting beside the clock, knowing he had to return it to Hinagi. At school, Yuri approached Mihu and asked to speak with him in private. Mihu was caught off guard but followed her out of the classroom without hesitation. Watching them leave, Hinagi couldn't help but wonder if Yuri was about to confess to Mihu. But knowing her, that seemed impossible. Everything Yuri did was always for Yukito's sake, which only confirmed Hinagi's suspicion. Yukito had really gone home early because he was sick. Still, curiosity got the better of her and she found herself eavesdropping on their conversation, a lingering worry for Yukito tugging at her. In the hallway, Mihu asked what was wrong and Yuri bluntly stated that she had a question about the previous day. Without warning, she lashed out, demanding to know why Yukito had come home soaked from the rain. Hearing this, Hinagi froze in confusion. He had gone home before everyone else, hadn't he? Did that mean he had gone back for the bear? Before she could piece it together, she instinctively ran after Yuri, calling out to ask if Yukito was okay. Without breaking her stride, Yuri responded flatly that it was just a mild cold, and that his fever had already gone down. Hinagi let out a sigh of relief, but before she could say anything else, Yuri abruptly cut her off, warning her not to test her patience. Turning to face Hinagi with a sharp glare, Yuri's tone turned cold and condescending as she demanded to know what really happened that day. Hinagi's body tensed, and in an instant all the guilt and emotions she had been holding back boiled over. Trembling, she finally broke down, confessing that everything was her fault. She had said something she never should have. Yuri smirked, asking her if she had tricked her brother again. With a threatening tone, she warned her not to do it again. Hinagi worried that Yuri was getting the wrong picture, but it didn't matter. She had to apologize first. However, before Hinagi could say anything, Yuri suddenly walked away, claiming that she didn't have time for her. Hinagi pleaded with her to listen, but Yuri flashed her a death glare, warning her not to follow. Left with no choice, Hinagi cried as Yuri faded into the distance. Meanwhile, Yukito was already starting to feel better. He flexed his body but then realized that he was bored and hungry. However, before he could get up to cook, he suddenly overheard people murmuring by the door. Just then, Yuri busted into the room, furiously looking at him. She asked if he felt better, and Yukito confirmed it. He then asked if someone was at the door and Yuri replied that it was the newspaper man. Yukito immediately caught on that his sister was lying and wasted no time calling her out on it. In response, Yuri challenged him to repeat what he had just said, forcing Yukito to backpedal and admit he had spoken out of turn. Raising an imaginary white flag in surrender, he conceded defeat, knowing full well that talking back to his sister was simply against the unspoken rules of their household. Without another word, Yuri handed him a plastic bag filled with supplies to help him feel better. To his surprise, everything inside was peach-flavored. She then asked if he needed anything else, noting that he already looked much better than he had that morning. Yukito declined, but Yuri insisted, offering to wipe him down and make him some porridge. Amused, Yukito let out a laugh, smugly questioning whether she even knew how to cook. That was a mistake. Offended, Yuri dared him to repeat himself, and Yukito immediately dropped to the floor in regret, knowing he had overstepped. Unwilling to risk his stomach on Yuri's cooking, Yukito decided he'd make the porridge himself. Ironically, despite being the one in perfect health, Yuri casually asked him to make a portion for her as well. Just then, his eyes landed on his phone. He hadn't checked it in a while. The moment he did, he was met with an overwhelming flood of messages from Hinagi, causing a wave of anxiety to wash over him. In that instant, he regretted checking his phone at all. A little while later, Yukito put on his jacket and excused himself to head to the convenience store. On the way, he unexpectedly ran into Hinagi, who wasted no time rushing toward him and pulling him into a tight embrace. Panicked, Yukito immediately tried to push her away, stammering that he smelled like sweat. However, Hinagi was stronger than he had anticipated. With tears welling in her eyes, she confessed how worried she had been, fearing something terrible had happened to him. Caught off guard, Yukito hesitated before asking if she had come to his house earlier. When she confirmed it, everything suddenly clicked. Yuri hadn't been arguing with the newspaper man, but with Hinagi. Realizing this, Yukito quickly apologized for his sister's behavior, but Hinagi simply laughed it off, saying that Yuri would be so mad if she heard that. Yukito was caught off guard by how unfazed Hinagi seemed about everything that had happened. He had expected her to be mad at Yuri, but she remained surprisingly calm. Without a word, Yukito handed her the ugly bear, and she accepted it without hesitation. She already knew he had gone back to find it, but Yukito, trying to play it cool, casually remarked that since he wasn't in any clubs, he had nothing better to do. Hinagi simply smiled, thanking him for retrieving the little symbol of their bond. As they continued walking, Hinagi apologized for all the trouble she had caused. Yukito, however, didn't acknowledge it and instead asked if her feet were okay. She reassured him they were fine, then reminisced about how nostalgic everything felt. They used to stay out late all the time, only to get scolded for it afterward. Out of nowhere, Hinagi suddenly declared that she didn't want to go home yet. Before she could process his response, Yukito randomly asked if she still had an issue with her smelly feet. Completely blindsided, Hinagi gawked at him, demanding to know how long he planned to believe that rumor. Yukito, genuinely confused, asked if she was worried about something other than the smell, and she immediately shot back, flustered that it wasn't like that. Seeing her over-the-top reaction, Yukito smirked, remarking that this was the Hinagi he knew. For a second, he had thought she had undergone a complete personality overhaul. At his words, Hinagi hesitated, softly asking if she had really changed. She instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, painfully aware that she had changed. On that day, he regretted the most. Wanting to shift the topic, she asked why he had gone back for the bear when he had been avoiding her all this time. Yukito simply smiled and said he was willing to help her when she was in trouble. Hinagi pressed further, asking if it was just because they were childhood friends, but he immediately shot that down. With a serious expression, Yukito told her that if she ever needed help, she should take the initiative to ask for it. He hesitated before reminding her, almost as if he needed to say it out loud for himself, that he could no longer be by her side. But before he could step away, Hinagi grabbed his arm, desperately pleading for him to stay by her side forever. "Girl, don't you have a man?" Yukito's face darkened. He turned away, telling her that wasn't his duty anymore. Then out of nowhere, Hinagi dropped a bombshell. She had broken up with her boyfriend, and the plot thickens. They had only lasted 2 weeks, and she apologized for not telling Yukito sooner. She wept before him, desperately asking if they couldn't go back to the old times as childhood friends. Yukito's response was immediate. He couldn't. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Hinagi, refusing to back down, asked if it was too late for them or if his heart belonged to Kamishiro. Yukito denied it outright, but his next words cut deeper than she expected. He didn't feel the same way about her anymore. Hinagi's breath hitched. She had prepared herself for a painful conversation, but hearing it out loud still stung. Still, she stood firm, her voice unwavering as she admitted that she had always liked him, even as kids. In fact, she had been overjoyed when he confessed to her. She had wanted to answer him right away, but she had her reasons. Before she could continue speaking, Yukito gently pushed her away from him, saying he didn't know she was such a liar. Ouch, right in the gut. Yukito wasn't buying a word of what she said. He asked if she truly hadn't dated her boyfriend simply because she liked him, or if, by her logic, she wouldn't mind dating someone she didn't like. Hinagi's fingers tightened around the bear, her voice trembling as she insisted that she was telling the truth. Back then, she had panicked. Yukito was popular, mature, and capable of achieving great things. On top of that, he was kind. Too kind. And when the rumors about him and Kamishiro started spreading, more and more girls started approaching him. Meanwhile, Hinagi felt shackled by her own life, unable to move forward until things spiraled beyond her control. She thought back to the childhood promise they once made, how she swore to always be by his side and how he vowed to help her whenever she needed him. She clung to that memory, wondering if Yukito had long since forgotten. But he hadn't. He went back for the bear, didn't he? Hinagi wanted to keep talking, to explain everything, but she couldn't stop Yukito from walking away. She stood there, frozen, unable to fix the mess she had created. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, guilt and regret gnawing at her. She had been too scared to lay her heart bare, fearing that if Yukito saw the ugliness inside her, he would hate her even more. She thought herself the worst person in the world, someone whose love had been tainted by jealousy and fear. But even so, she lifted her chin, determination flaring in her chest. If she wanted to move forward, she had to take the first step. First, she had to mend what was broken. She would make him stop hating her. Then, only then, would she finally apologize for everything. Even if it meant starting from a place where he resented her, she would prove to him the true love of Suzurikawa Hinagi. Alright, pack it up, Sailor Moon. Yuri handed Yukito a 1,000 yen bill, and he immediately assumed it was meant to cover his medical expenses. Though she had already showered him with gifts the day before, he couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. However, the moment he voiced his concern, Yuri's temper flared. She demanded to know if he was mocking her, leaving Yukito too horrified to argue. Silently, he accepted the money, deciding it was best not to push his luck. Just as he thought the ordeal was over, Yuri extended her hand, insisting they should walk hand in hand since he had just recovered. Yukito nearly short-circuited at the suggestion. Was his sister out of her mind? They were in high school now. Walking around holding hands was the ultimate form of social suicide. Worse, if he gave in once, it would only encourage her further. Without hesitation, he refused. At least, that's how things should have gone. Instead, by the time they reached school, Yuri was latched onto his arm like a bloodthirsty leech. Yukito could only sigh in defeat as they walked through the gates, fully aware of the eyes glued on them. Whispers erupted around them, and a few students even speculated if they were a couple. This woman has some undiagnosed problems. By the time he made it to class, Yukito wasted no time slumping into his seat, mentally cursing whatever cosmic force had doomed him to this fate. His misery was short-lived, however, as Mihu strolled over, grinning from ear to ear. With barely contained amusement, he teased Yukito about his dramatic entrance. That was the final straw. Yukito snapped, hastily clarifying that this entire situation was Yuri's doing. Thanks to his crazy sister, he was now the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Overwhelmed, he abruptly stood up, declaring that he was heading to the canteen. Mihu pointed out that rumors would follow him there too, but Yukito dismissed the comment, insisting that he just wanted to buy something. Meanwhile, as Yuri was deep in thought, a sudden realization hit her, causing her friend to take notice and ask what was wrong. A wave of unease washed over Yuri as she questioned whether she had unknowingly become a sugar sister, financially supporting Yukito in the way a sugar daddy might be taken advantage of. The thought left her restless, wondering if her brother was subtly manipulating her generosity. Her friend, upon hearing this, could only sigh and express concern for Yuri's overactive imagination. Meanwhile, in another part of the school, a girl named Kyuka was informed that someone was looking for her. As she stood to meet this mysterious visitor, her classmates playfully teased her about her growing popularity. To her surprise, the boy waiting for her immediately asked her out. Though caught off guard, Kyuka swiftly turned him down. The boy, unfazed, pressed her for a reason, but she could only stammer, unsure of what to say. Seizing the moment, he proposed an alternative. They could start dating and get to know each other along the way. He then inquired if she had feelings for someone else, but she bashfully denied it. Her gaze drifted toward the stairs where Yukito sat, contently munching on sweet buns and muttering to himself. The boy, noticing Yukito's presence, asked if he needed anything, but Yukito simply responded that he was only there to enjoy his food. In his usual dramatic fashion, he declared himself a gloomy loner and assured them they could continue their conversation without minding him. However, the boy wasn't convinced, finding it difficult to ignore his presence. Eventually, the boy gave up and walked away, leaving Kyuka standing alone. Yukito exhaled in relief, satisfied that the trash had taken itself out. But before he could fully savor his victory, Kyuka suddenly sat beside him, expressing her relief that the awkward situation was finally over. Panic crept into Yukito's expression. He had just dodged one disturbance only to be roped into another. Without hesitation, Kyuka struck up a conversation, questioning why he was there and even jokingly asking if he had come to confess to her as well. Unbothered, Yukito shot back, telling his senpai that she was a bit too delusional. Unfazed by his bluntness, Kyuka revealed that she hadn't even known the boy who had confessed to her earlier, which was why she hadn't given him a proper response. Yukito, caught off guard by the admission, made it clear that he didn't ask. Wow, thanks for the emotional support. Kyuka, amused by his attitude, wondered if he was truly her junior given how rude he was being. Yukito, however, remained composed, stating that his two sweet buns were far more interesting than anything she had to say. Stunned, Kyuka's eyes welled up as she dramatically questioned whether she had actually lost to a couple of pastries. Yukito, on the other hand, was bewildered. Why was this girl sharing such things with someone she had only just met? Undeterred, Kyuka pressed on, urging him to at least listen to her, pointing out that he was just a gloomy loner with no friends. Without hesitation, Yukito loudly accused her of being an attention seeker, catching Kyuka off guard. Flustered, she panicked and immediately asked if he was angry. Out of nowhere, tears welled up in Yukito's eyes as he unexpectedly grew emotional. He admitted that, for an attention grabber, Kyuka was actually a kind person. Despite always seeing himself as a gloomy loner, no one had ever acknowledged it the way she did. And for some strange reason, that made him incredibly happy. Kyuka, baffled by the sudden praise, questioned why he was flattering her now. But any hope of a genuine moment was immediately shattered when Yukito casually reminded her that she was still an attention grabber. Annoyed by the constant name-calling, Kyuka finally snapped, demanding that he stop referring to her that way, especially when she was already experiencing one of the most embarrassing moments of her life. Completely unfazed, Yukito asked what she preferred to be called instead, only to quickly realize that he didn't actually care. This revelation sent Kyuka into a fit of fury. Just as the tension built, Kyuka's mood abruptly shifted, and she formally introduced herself as Suma Kyuka, a second-year student. Meanwhile, Yukito remained completely uninterested, his full attention still fixated on his sweet buns, completely ignoring her introduction. Frustrated, Kyuka practically begged him to show interest in something, anything other than food. She insisted that he introduce himself as well, prompting Yukito to finally mutter his name. She then curiously asked if he would continue coming to that spot, to which he nonchalantly replied that he did so once or twice a week, though he also ate in his classroom. Upon hearing this, Kyuka's lips curled into a small smile. If that was the case, she might start visiting the spot more often too. Cringe. Yukito let out a small sigh, commenting that it would be troublesome. However, he quickly took it back, but it was too late. Kyuko was keeping tabs on the things he said. Standing up, she stretched and remarked that she felt better after talking to him. Just as she was about to leave, Yukito, ever the opportunist, casually asked for a consultation fee. Without missing a beat, Kyuko promised to bring him some cream buns next time. At this, Yukito's eyes practically sparkled. He dramatically called her a goddess and insisted on addressing her as such from now on. Kyuko, now officially done with him, screamed at him to knock it off before stomping away. As silence returned, Yukito mourned the loss of his peaceful hideout. With a deep sigh, he wondered when his quiet school life would actually come true. That afternoon, the sky betrayed him. The rain came down in thick sheets, leaving Yukito stranded in some random alley. The weather report had failed him, and of course, he hadn't thought to bring an umbrella. He glanced at the sky, judging if it would let up anytime soon, but seeing no sign of mercy, he mustered the courage to make a break for it. With his school bag held over his head, he sprinted through the rain. That was when he noticed a woman stepping out of a cab. She carried multiple boxes, visibly struggling as the rain drenched her. Without thinking, Yukito rushed over to help. The woman tried to refuse at first, but he reassured her that he lived nearby. Finally, with a small, grateful smile, she formally asked for his assistance. Yukito agreed, leading to his next questionable life decision. Soon, Yukito found himself inside the woman's apartment. The place was sparsely furnished, which she explained was because she had just moved in. He then sat on her sofa, still slightly damp from the rain, and suddenly became painfully aware of his situation. A woman had just invited him into her home. Before his brain could spiral into anything inappropriate, the woman returned with tea, formally introducing herself as Himiyama Hisaki. Yukito responded in kind, but the moment his name left his lips, something changed. Hisaki's eyes widened in shock. Then, without warning, she sat down way too close to him. "Welcome to Pound Town, Junior." Trying to break the awkward silence, Yukito asked if she lived alone. Himiyama then opened up about her past. She once had a fiancé, but after her infertility treatments failed, his family rejected her because they wanted an heir to inherit their inn. Yukito was stunned. Does he have free therapy plastered on his forehead? First Kyuka, now this? He started wondering if he had some weird energy that attracted emotionally distressed people. Meanwhile, Himiyama kept venting about her failed relationship, lamenting that she wouldn't be alone if only she could have a child. As if that wasn't enough oversharing, she suddenly mentioned that she also once dreamed of becoming a teacher but failed at that too. Trying to keep the conversation from spiraling further into existential despair, Yukito chimed in that she would make a great homeroom teacher. That was all it took. Himiyama, visibly moved, grabbed his hand and stared at him with teary eyes, practically begging for validation. With tears welling up in her eyes, she asked if he would truly be happy if she were his teacher. She seemed very desperate for a positive comment, so Yukito gave her the answer she needed. Hearing this, Himiyama thanked him and asked if he wanted to be friends. Yukito didn't really have a choice, so he said yes. Himiyama suddenly sprang from her seat, deciding that she should introduce herself to Yukito's parents as a newcomer to the neighborhood. She also declared that she would bring soba for the occasion. Wasting no time, she grabbed Yukito and dragged him to his house, leaving him with little say in the matter. At the door, Yukito's mother hesitated upon hearing someone outside. When she opened it and saw Himiyama, concern immediately crossed her face as she wondered what kind of trouble her son had gotten into this time. Before she could say anything, Yukito quickly introduced Himiyama, explaining that she had just moved nearby. Relieved by the harmless explanation, his mother welcomed her, and Himiyama politely handed over the soba she had brought. As they stood in the doorway, Himiyama shared that Yukito had helped her move her things. However, throughout the conversation, Yukito remained stiff, in more places than one, distracted by something strange. She still hadn't let go of his hand. The lingering contact made him question how they had ended up holding hands in the first place. Himiyama, completely unbothered, then turned to Yukito with a warm smile, announcing that she would do anything he wanted as a token of gratitude. His mind instantly raced, seizing the opportunity without hesitation. He was, after all, a man who knew exactly what he wanted. With a teasing expression, Himiyama leaned in, encouraging him to simply say the word. Yukito was left speechless, wondering if this was too extravagant a reward for merely helping someone move stuff. However, before she could push things further, he quickly warned her not to spoil him too much, or he might just take her up on the offer and request an embrace. Without any warning, Himiyama suddenly pulled Yukito into a tight embrace, pressing his face directly into her giant melons. Yukito tried to escape her clutches, insisting it was all just a joke, though he couldn't deny his surprise at how soft it felt. Meanwhile, his mother stood frozen in complete disbelief, struggling to process what she was witnessing. Lost in the moment, Yukito found himself oddly at peace, as if all his worries had vanished right then and there. However, his bliss was short-lived as his mother snapped him back to reality, shouting at him to get a grip. After the whole ordeal, Himiyama gently patted Yukito on the head, offering an apology for treating him like a child. The situation was already ridiculous enough, but Yukito casually admitted that it was actually a first for him. He had never experienced something like that before. In the middle of this bizarre moment, Yukito commented that Himiyama gave off the feeling of a mother figure, leaving his actual mother completely stunned at what she was hearing. Later on, Yukito apologized for his earlier inappropriate request, but Himiyama brushed it off, assuring him that he could always ask if he ever wanted to be pampered. However, a hint of sadness crept onto her face as she seemed to realize that this small gesture was all she could really give. Holding back tears, she excused herself and quietly left for home. Afterward, Yukito's mother found herself lost in thought, replaying the moment when Yukito said Himiyama felt more like a mother than she did. Searching her memory, she struggled to recall the last time she had ever spoiled her son, only to realize she never really had. Looking into Yukito's eyes, she sensed that he was someone who had grown used to expecting nothing from anyone. Guilt hit her hard as she came to terms with her own neglect. Realizing the damage had been done long ago, she knew she had no one to blame but herself. The thought of Yukito feeling unloved weighed heavily on her. Her spiral of regret was interrupted when Yukito mentioned her early arrival home. Snapping back to reality, she explained that she'd be working remotely for a while, only needing to go into the office once a week. With this new arrangement, she silently vowed to make amends and repair their relationship. Determined, she wasted no time putting on an apron and heading to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Soon after, Yuri entered the room, greeting everyone as she walked in. Without missing a beat, she turned to her brother, reminding him to speak up if he ever needed anything, stressing that she didn't require any kind of payment in return. Yukito nodded, though he found himself wondering what exactly she meant by anything. His mind drifted back to that morning when Yuri handed him some money, and he couldn't help but suspect that she might have been the one in need of help. Trying to be proactive, Yukito offered to dip into his savings, which immediately caught Yuri off guard. She questioned whether he was really that eager to get her involved in something. Yukito simply explained that he didn't have much use for the money anyway, but Yuri argued that relying on it like that wouldn't be healthy. Building up her confidence, Yuri declared she was ready to step up and help him, no payment required. Yukito, unsure where this was even going, agreed without much thought. Before she left the room, Yuri shot him an unsettling, oddly suggestive glance, reinforcing that she'd do whatever it took, leaving Yukito completely bewildered. What in the sweet home Alabama is this? Not long after, their mother called Yuri over to help wash the vegetables. Without hesitation, Yuri agreed, but then casually asked which detergent she should use, leaving both Yukito and their mother visibly stunned. The rest of the evening carried on quietly, but Yukito couldn't shake one lingering thought. What exactly did Yuri mean when she said it would be unhealthy? While the principal relaxed in his office, his attention shifted to the noise coming from below. Looking out the window, he spotted the first-year students undergoing their physical examination. Among them, several stood out with impressive speed, catching his eye as they raced across the field. Meanwhile, Yukito struggled to keep pace, falling behind Mihu, who wasted no time flaunting his victory. Frustrated and clinging to what pride he had left, Yukito regretted ever challenging the school's athletic ace. Desperate to salvage the situation, he threw down a new challenge, this time testing their flexibility. Elsewhere on the field, the girls gathered to cheer on Kamishiro, who had just set a new record. Watching from a distance, Yukito couldn't help but acknowledge her natural talent and remarkable athletic build. Still, something seemed off. Approaching her, he asked if she was feeling well, noting the subtle signs of fatigue. Kamishiro brushed it off with a forced smile, insisting that she was perfectly fine. Yukito, however, wasn't convinced. He'd only asked out of concern, but her dismissive response made the moment awkward, and he quietly excused himself, apologizing for bothering her. Before he could walk away, Kamishiro grabbed onto his jacket, stopping him. In a rare moment of honesty, she admitted she wasn't okay because she had skipped breakfast and hadn't eaten properly since the night before. Not wanting to seem weak, she had kept it to herself. Around them, the other girls watched the scene unfold, surprised by the unexpected confession. Yukito gently asked if her empty stomach was due to oversleeping, but Kamishiro explained she'd been busy and hadn't found time to eat anything beyond some instant noodles. Yukito sighed, unimpressed with her idea of a meal, pointing out that ramen alone hardly counted as proper nourishment. Despite the scolding, Kamishiro felt oddly comforted by his concern, though she reminded him that this wasn't exactly the best place to have such a personal conversation. Word of Kamishiro's condition quickly spread. One of the nearby girls asked if it was really true that she wasn't feeling well. Kamishiro downplayed it, assuring everyone that she wasn't so unwell that she couldn't keep going. Still curious, one of the girls asked Yukito how he even noticed something was wrong when no one else did. Yukito explained that Kamishiro's ponytail was usually lively and bounced around when she was in high spirits, but today it barely moved at all. His observation left the girls speechless, while Kamishiro argued back, pointing out that her ponytail wasn't some kind of mood indicator like a dog's tail. As whispers and gossip began swirling around them, Yukito remained unfazed, standing confidently by his theory without a second thought. Yukito gently reminded Kamishiro not to push herself too hard. With a soft smile, she nodded and apologized for making him worry. As he walked away, Yukito felt somewhat reassured that Kamishiro would be alright. But deep down there was still this lingering sense of unease he couldn't shake. Later that day, Yukito suddenly found himself cornered by a group of girls, all demanding to know if he was the Yukito Kokonoe everyone was talking about. Just like that, Bro had entered the harem multiverse. As the girls closed in around him, Yukito's brain spiraled. Was this one of those moments where he'd been reincarnated into a dating sim? Before he could get too lost in that thought, one of the girls snapped him back to reality, leaving him low-key shook that they weren't mind readers after all. While Yukito was still trying to process his accidental dating sim daydream, one of the girls asked if a certain girl would finally join the basketball team if he gave his approval. Totally confused, Yukito asked if they were talking about Kamishiro. Turns out Kamishiro had announced that she was willing to become the manager of the basketball club, the same one Yukito had been planning to join. She even told the others that if Yukito decided to join, she'd gladly sign up too. Yukito was stunned, realizing Kamishiro was basically acting like his personal manager now. Plus, it's not like he could even join the girls' basketball team anyway. Before he could respond, a random guy appeared out of nowhere, grabbed Yukito by the collar and demanded the girls hand him over. Yukito, honestly grateful for the rescue, thanked him, but the guy brushed it off like it was nothing. He explained that Mihu would agree to join the track and field club if Yukito joined too, so he was there to convince him. Hearing Mihu's name, Yukito was instantly annoyed. Picturing that smug, solar-powered face of his, the girl from the basketball team was absolutely livid, snapping at the guy from the track and field team, reminding him that she was the first to invite Yukito. But the track and field guy shot back, saying she didn't exactly have exclusive rights to recruit new talent. And if that was the case, he and his squad weren't about to hold back. Before Yukito could even process the chaos, more club leaders popped up out of nowhere like it was some sort of ambush. The soccer club leader stormed in, furious that they had already claimed Yukito first. Meanwhile, the leaders from the doubles tennis club and the baseball club both jumped in too, each trying to convince Yukito to pick their team instead. Meanwhile, Yukito stood there completely dumbfounded, wondering how all these people had just magically spawned around him. Instead of giving anyone an answer, Yukito dramatically placed his hand on his chin and concluded that this whole mess was probably because of the declining birth rate of the country. And with that very intellectual observation, Yukito decided the only logical move was to just run away from everyone. Later on, Yukito vented to Mihu about the absolute disaster he got himself tangled in. But instead of offering any sympathy, Mihu just laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Meanwhile, Kamishiro rushed over to apologize, frantically explaining that she never expected the club members to go that overboard. Trying to calm him down, she reassured Yukito that the madness couldn't possibly last forever. Before the drama could continue, the teacher strolled into the room and announced that she'd drawn lots to decide everyone's new seating arrangements. As things settled, a girl named Mineta greeted Yukito. Trying to fit in, Yukito awkwardly attempted to sprinkle some girly lingo into the convo like he was trying to prove he was in the know. But Mineta just shut that down real quick, telling him there was absolutely no need for that. That moment made Yukito realize that talking like a girl wasn't exactly the secret weapon he thought it was. To make things worse, Mineta was visibly weirded out by how Yukito acted like girls were some kind of rare exotic creatures. Trying to play it off, Yukito claimed he was actually the rare animal here. Mineta laughed, but Yukito felt slightly betrayed by her reaction. Seeing his face, she quickly reassured him she didn't mean it like that. Then, out of nowhere, one of the other girls chimed in, telling Yukito that his dark jokes weren't exactly landing. That made him pause, questioning if they were really that bad that someone had to call him out publicly. Mihu, listening from the sidelines, was absolutely floored that Yukito was just now realizing this. A boy named Takashi suddenly invited himself into the conversation, but Yukito immediately shut him down with a glare, telling him that only gloomy people were allowed in this group. And just as everyone started getting a bit too comfortable, the teacher snapped at the class, reminding them that exams were right around the corner, and they better start prioritizing their studies. Then her mood took a sharp turn, as she revealed that 3 idiots from the Go Home Club had stirred up trouble, which then spiraled into chaos in the staff room. Yukito, absolutely oblivious to his involvement, leaned over to Kamishiro and casually warned her not to cause any trouble. But the teacher shut that down immediately, flat out telling Yukito he was one of the troublemakers. Sensei really hit him with the newsflash. Before leaving, the teacher gave everyone one last reminder to do their best on the exams. As she stepped out, she threw a sarcastic question at Mihu, aka Idiot Number 2, asking how he was holding up. Mihu, a bit embarrassed, mumbled that he was doing fine. After she left, Mihu turned to Yukito with a deadpan stare and officially labeled him Idiot Number 1, which naturally left Yukito fuming. Just then, Idiot Number 3, Kamishiro, turned to Yukito with a hopeful look, asking him to help her with her studies. That was all the motivation he needed. From that moment on, Yukito decided it was his life's mission to establish the ultimate study group. Mihu was absolutely on board with this ridiculous plan, proudly declaring himself Idiot Number 2, Yukito's right-hand man. However, things quickly spiraled out of control when their little study session suddenly became a full-blown movement. Yukito narrowed his eyes at Kamishiro, demanding an explanation. She sheepishly admitted that when she casually mentioned the study group, the news spread like wildfire and everyone wanted in. At that moment, the classroom erupted in cheers as students began assigning numbers to themselves. Fantastic! Now Yukito was leading an entire squad of self-proclaimed idiots. In the midst of the chaos, a girl named Hinagi timidly introduced herself as Idiot Number 8. Yukito blinked at her, confused. Why the hell was she here? She was smarter than everyone in the room combined. Clearly irritated, Hinagi shot back that there were some things she wasn't confident in. And so the legendary study group began. Yukito strutted up to the board, writing like he actually knew what he was talking about. With a dramatic flourish, he scrawled an equation onto the board, declaring that this exact question was bound to show up on the test. Mineta raised an eyebrow, questioning how he could possibly know that. Smirking, Yukito explained that the question had appeared on the exam 4 years in a row, so the odds were practically guaranteed. Then, with all the confidence of a prophet, he revealed his secret weapon. His saintly sister had blessed him with last year's test papers. The room erupted in cheers. The group was fired up, practically worshipping him as their new academic god. How gloomy of you, Yukito. As Yukito continued scribbling on the board, Kamishiro suddenly raised her hand to make an announcement, declaring that this was no longer a study group. Confused, Yukito wondered why, prompting Kamishiro to explain that a proper study group should involve learning how to actually solve problems, not just memorizing answers. After thinking it over, Yukito casually admitted that he personally wasn't struggling with any of the questions. This blunt and tone-deaf response immediately set off the group. Mineta, feeling completely over it, dramatically complained to Sakurai about how much she despised Yukito. Mihu, as usual, agreed without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. This only made Mineta even more emotional, declaring that she hated Mihu too. Meanwhile, Kamishiro warned Mihu not to let Yukito manipulate him, leaving him genuinely baffled as to when any so-called brainwashing had even taken place. Yukito, on the other hand, was stunned at how quickly Mihu changed sides. Feeling cornered, Yukito made a desperate attempt to win over Sakurai, seeking any form of backup. But Sakurai saw right through him, coldly brushing off the attempt and making it clear that no amount of pleading looks would change the situation. With everyone turning on him, Yukito could only lament the unfortunate reality that they had become rivals in the end. What a bunch of traitors. Amid the chaos, Hinagi, unaware of the drama, calmly asked what everyone was even doing and urged them to focus and prepare properly. Eventually, the group shifted gears and started solving actual problems instead of relying on recycled test questions. During the session, Sakurai couldn't help but notice how skilled Hinagi was at teaching. Her methods were clear, her tone was gentle, and her explanations were on point. The closet it made of glass. Sakurai. While the others were hard at work, Kamishiro approached Yukito for help on a particular question. After helping her out and making sure she understood, Yukito quietly distanced himself from the group to observe from afar. As the study session carried on, Yukito noticed a strange dynamic. Kamishiro and Hinagi weren't interacting at all. Curious, he asked Sakurai if there was some history between them. Without hesitation, Sakurai and Mineta confirmed it. The two were indeed rivals. Eventually, the study session came to an end, leaving everyone completely drained. Yukito, trying to lift the mood, reassured the group that they had covered pretty much everything, even if it was all a bit rushed. With a confident voice, he told everyone that they should be able to avoid failing grades now. Meanwhile, Kamishiro looked like she was on the verge of a full system shutdown, complaining that her brain felt like it was about to short-circuit. Yukito couldn't help but laugh, casually suggesting that she find a way to unwind. He shared that whenever he felt fried like that, he'd head over to the park and shoot some hoops. Kamishiro was shocked to hear that he still played basketball, but he explained that it was just a way to refresh his mind. Then, without missing a beat, Kamishiro asked if she could come with him. Yukito smiled and told her she could do whatever she wanted. And just like that, Kamishiro looked a little less stressed. Later that day, Yukito found himself at the park shooting hoops to shake off the stress from studying. After landing a clean shot, he held his arm up, still feeling a bit off about playing basketball again. But he brushed the thought away. No big deal. Meanwhile, Kamishiro, full of energy, announced that her warm-up was over and she was ready to jump in. Yukito couldn't believe she actually tagged along and started to wonder if inviting her was even a smart move. Before long, a group of older guys rolled onto the court calling out to Yukito. Their leader, Hayakuma, greeted him saying it had been a while. Yukito introduced Kamishiro, explaining these were some university players he'd known since middle school, and they'd been playing together ever since. Kamishiro was polite and friendly, but things took a weird turn when one of the guys asked if she was Yukito's girlfriend. Flustered, she quickly denied it, which only made them tease that they must still be figuring things out. Out of nowhere, Yukito tossed out the wild claim that Kamishiro was a dog, leaving her completely stunned. The guys immediately ran with it, joking about how far along their relationship must be if they were already pulling off such extreme positions. Kamishiro panicked, scrambling to clear up the misunderstanding, but Yukito just kept adding fuel to the fire by calling himself a stray dog who didn't even have a collar. Desperate, Kamishiro blurted out that her name was officially listed on the Kamishiro family pedigree, which left everyone speechless, now genuinely questioning if she was actually, somehow, a dog. At that moment, Yukito clarified that he and Kamishiro were just classmates. Kamishiro quickly introduced herself, mentioning that she knew how to play basketball and had come out to exercise with him. Hayakuma smirked, realizing Yukito hadn't changed at all. Soon after, Hayakuma invited both of them to join their game since they were already there. Yukito and Kamishiro happily agreed, and the match began. As the game went on, everyone was impressed by Yukito's skills. He found himself fully immersed, realizing he felt more excited than usual. This was different from the usual club games. It was purely for fun. With each shot, he realized how good it felt to simply enjoy the game again, and he was glad he could still feel that way. Later on, Hayakuma and the others said their goodbyes, mentioning how much fun they had and suggesting they play again sometime. Once Yukito and Kamishiro were alone, Kamishiro asked if he planned on heading home, but he casually replied that he wanted something sweet. With a determined look, he announced that he wanted a crepe, so the two of them went to satisfy his craving. While they ate, Kamishiro couldn't help but think how much it felt like a casual date. Almost as if he had read her mind, Yukito suddenly commented that he would hate having a smelly date, leaving her caught off guard. On their way home, Kamishiro mentioned she didn't know Yukito had friends like the ones they just played with. Yukito replied that she didn't know everything about him, prompting Kamishiro to say that she wanted to learn more. She added that the day felt nostalgic, like being back in middle school, and spending time with him made her happy. Yukito admitted that he had fun too. It had been a while since he felt that way. Hearing this, Kamishiro excitedly suggested they play again sometime and even offered to be his manager. But Yukito's mood shifted, and he seriously reminded her to stop trying to make up for her mistakes, just like he'd told her before. Kamishiro clarified that wasn't what she meant. She only wanted to see him play again, though she admitted it might be selfish of her. Yukito replied that he didn't really have the motivation or a goal to push himself like that anymore. When Kamishiro asked if he'd consider playing again if he found a reason, he said it would depend. For now, he explained, being part of the Go Home Club felt right. He was getting used to a more laid-back lifestyle, and honestly, he didn't mind it. But even as he said all this, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kamishiro was different. People depended on her. Someone like her shouldn't be wasting her talents doing nothing in the Go Home Club. More than that, her bright personality had probably saved countless people, just like it had saved him once. And yet, lately she didn't smile as much. Out of nowhere, Kamishiro hugged him from behind and confessed that she wanted to stay with him because she liked him. She begged him not to leave. Back then, she didn't even understand why she'd said those hurtful things. Yukito, completely confused, admitted he didn't know what she was trying to say. Kamishiro stayed quiet, realizing how complicated love could be. When Yukito pressed her for answers, she simply held his hand, explaining that despite everything, he still protected her even after all the cruel things she'd said. That was why she was standing there now. Most importantly, she confessed she still had feelings for him. It wasn't about repaying him or fixing the past. This was just her honest wish. She placed his hand over her heart and asked if she was finally reaching him. Yukito brushed it off, saying her heartbeat was probably from all the exercise. But Kamishiro argued they had already cooled down and he should at least acknowledge her feelings. Suddenly, Yukito pulled his hand away, saying he didn't understand. Internally, he struggled, unsure how to handle her getting so close. Then, in an unexpected move, he wiped a bit of cream off her cheek. Kamishiro laughed, admitting she'd been waiting for him to notice and clean it off. Yukito felt a bit awkward. Then Kamishiro continued, reminding him of how he once shared his reasons for playing basketball. She asked if maybe she could become his new reason to play again. Just then, Kamishiro placed the back of his hand on her chest again, gently saying that she wanted to become his motivation. Kamishiro admitted she didn't want this moment to end, not when they were finally getting somewhere. Yukito, still unsure, asked if this so-called motivation included getting physically close to her. It was a bold and inappropriate question, but Kamishiro, without hesitation, said she didn't mind if that's what it took to inspire him. Gently placing his palm on her cheek, she reminded him once more that she truly liked him. She wasn't lying, and it wasn't about making up for her mistakes, it was just her sincere wish. Sis got balls for days. Yukito had always found the concept of liking someone to be ambiguous. He assumed any feelings he had would eventually fade into mere fantasies. Even his past affection for Hinagi had completely vanished. Adding to his cynicism, his mother had gone through a divorce. As he gazed out of Himiyama's window, he pondered Japan's 35% divorce rate, realizing that promises of eternal love were ultimately meaningless. This was simply the harsh reality of life. At that moment, Himiyama entered the room, announcing that she had finally finished moving her things, which was why she had invited him over again. She brought him cakes and coffee, asking him to choose his favorite. Then out of nowhere, she cheerfully expressed how happy she was to have run into him. Yukito, however, vividly remembered how Himiyama had randomly grabbed him on his way home, and just like before, she was sitting far too close. There was no doubt about it. This woman was trying to seduce him. Feeling uncomfortable, Yukito shifted away slightly, explaining that he was worried about smelling like sweat. But instead of backing off, Himiyama simply replied that she didn't mind. "Seriously, read the room, woman." He told himself he needed to leave immediately, otherwise he'd sink even deeper into this quicksand. But his body wouldn't budge. The soothing aroma in the air was chipping away at his resistance, and soon he didn't want to move at all. After all, he was just a guy. Ignoring a beautiful woman wasn't exactly in his nature. His thoughts drifted to a memory of his mother attending Parents' Day. Her beauty had been so striking that he forced himself to keep his eyes on the blackboard, unable to look at her directly. Among the many guardians present, she stood out the most. Dude has a thing for his mom. Classic. The conversation then shifted as Yukito questioned Himiyama about her fiancé. She grew defensive, assuring him that her loyalty belonged to him instead. However, he brushed aside her response and pressed further, wanting to know her true thoughts about her ex-fiancé. The question lingered in his mind, tied to his own memories of his mother's divorce. After a pause, Himiyama admitted that she had once liked him, but some circumstances couldn't be overcome by love alone. In the end, they had no choice but to part ways. Curious, Yukito asked if she had managed to erase her feelings entirely. Himiyama explained that she hadn't. She had simply given up on them. With all emotions set aside, the most she could say was that she had loved her ex-fiancé in the past, but not anymore. A sense of unease settled over Yukito as he sulked, lamenting that he could never imagine himself feeling that way for anyone. Himiyama, noticing his frustration, gently patted his head, advising him not to dwell on such thoughts. As a student, his focus should be on himself. However, she reminded him that some priorities never truly disappear, just like the wounds people leave on others. Her words struck him deeply, leaving him so stunned that he had to step away and clear his thoughts. Later, as he sat down for dinner at Himi's place, his mind continued to wander. He questioned whether he was even capable of developing emotions in the way others did. Just as he pondered this, Himiyama appeared in a revealing new outfit, one that barely concealed anything. A shiver ran through him as he tensed up, feeling as if she were actively trying to end him then and there. The situation escalated further when Himiyama moved closer. She playfully hinted at a secret, challenging him with her presence. His composure cracked as she asked if she looked good, forcing him to admit that she did. Despite his desperate attempts to maintain control, Himiyama continued to push, questioning whether something had already been broken. That was the final straw. Overwhelmed, Yukito bolted from the room, unwilling to deal with Himiyama any longer. Yukito returned home in a daze, his behavior immediately causing concern for his mother. He muttered under his breath about how clothing would be the death of him before heading straight to the bathroom for a shower. Observing his strange state, his mother began to suspect that Himiyama might not be just an ordinary neighbor after all. Her thoughts then drifted to her son and the kind of relationship they shared. If Yukito had any luck with women, it likely stemmed from her influence. She considered how childhood experiences shape a person, and in his case, she had only given him a small portion of the love he deserved. Her demanding schedule meant she was often absent, leaving early for work and barely spending time with him. Before she knew it, he had stopped confiding in her altogether. Even though Yuri, his older sister, had doted on him, she was still just a child herself. Then came the incident with Yuri, an event that changed everything. From that moment on, Yukito became a different person. His emotions and words seemed locked away, unreachable. His dark, distant gaze reflected nothing but rejection. A memory resurfaced from a time she visited his class. Other children eagerly waved at their mothers, but Yukito never even turned his head. The realization stung, though she knew she had no one to blame but herself. Even so, she was still his mother. No matter how much he distanced himself, she refused to stop showing him her love. That was the one thing she would never give up on. At that moment, Yukito's mother entered the shower, insisting that it wasn't unusual for them to bathe together at times. However, the situation left him utterly stunned. Despite his shock, his mother remained unfazed, genuinely believing that washing the back of his head was a perfectly normal way to show her affection. Completely overwhelmed, Yukito panicked, exclaiming in frustration that he couldn't even have peace in his own home. "Can my boy please catch a break?" A short-haired girl stood by the train station gazing at her phone as she read a text message. Her friend Yumi was asking for help, and the short-haired girl couldn't wait to jump into action. Elsewhere, Yukito sat in a crowded train, realizing that it seemed like a baptism for corporate slaves. The day before, Yukito paid a visit to his aunt Yukika, his mother's younger sister. Years ago, due to certain circumstances, he actually lived at Yukika's place for a while. Ever since then, overnight stays there had become a regular thing, but whenever he stayed over, it meant commuting to school by train. Fortunately, that morning, Yukito managed to snag a seat, winning the daily game of musical chairs. He felt pretty good about himself, especially with all the jealous eyes on him. But that moment didn't last long. In the crowd, Yukito noticed a man with black hair being a perv. Disgusted and shocked, he watched the scene unfold. The train was already a chaotic mess, and this just made the morning even worse. Somehow, as always, Yukito's streak of bad luck with women continued, and once again he found himself in trouble. Jumping to the present, Yukito was now pinned to the ground by a short-haired girl. She was fuming, calling him out for daring to show his face at school after allegedly being a molester. Without holding back, she grilled Yukito, demanding to know if he felt no shame. Yukito insisted it wasn't him, but the girl refused to believe a word. He quickly realized that arguing back would only make things worse. She wasn't going to listen. The girl accused Yukito of being a perv to her friend Hiromi Yumi, claiming she had seen it happen with her own eyes. But all Yukito could do was sarcastically suggest she should probably get her vision checked. Bars? The girl went on to say that if Yukito had just admitted to what happened and apologized, maybe there would have been some room for forgiveness. But Yukito refused to admit to something he didn't do. Frustrated, the girl asked if he thought being a student made him immune to punishment. To her, talking to him felt like a waste of time. People like him, she said, didn't belong at their school. Just then, a police officer arrived, concerned about what was happening. But before things escalated, a woman stepped forward and defended Yukito, saying he wasn't the culprit. When Yukito looked up, he recognized her. She was the woman from the train, the one he had given his seat to earlier. She backed him up, thanking him for his kindness and asking Yumi to rethink what had actually happened. The woman pointed out that Yukito only came close to Yumi when they arrived at the station, and she gently encouraged her to recall who else had been nearby when the assault took place. Eventually, Yumi realized her mistake and bowed in apology to Yukito. Realizing he had only tried to help her, Yukito told her it was fine, saying they both shared some blame in how things turned out. The short-haired girl supported Yumi, helping her through the situation, but as Yukito turned to leave, his expression hardened. With a bitter edge, he muttered that maybe helping out had been a mistake after all. The short-haired girl was caught off guard by Yukito's words. Feeling guilty, she quickly apologized, promising she'd never make the same mistake again. But Yukito didn't even bother to look back. He just turned away, coldly saying he'd never help her again. Desperate, the girl grabbed his arm, insisting she was wrong and begging him to listen. But Yukito brushed her hand off with a sharp flick, telling her he was done with the whole thing. With that, he walked off, leaving both girls standing there, worried and speechless. Later at school, Yukito was nowhere to be found. His classmates started to notice his absence from every class. Mihu had been trying to reach him but got no replies, leaving him wondering what exactly had happened to Yukito. Just then, the short-haired girl barged into Yukito's classroom, boldly announcing that she was looking for him. The whole class went silent, surprised to see her there. That's when it was revealed. She wasn't just some random girl, she was actually the student council president. And to top it off, Yumi, the girl from the train incident, was the vice president. The room buzzed with whispers, everyone realizing this situation was way bigger than they thought. Meanwhile, Fujishiro, the teacher, was quietly enjoying lunch in the staff room when Mutsuki Kadu, the short-haired girl, stormed in, demanding to know everything about Yukito. Fujishiro blinked, confused by the sudden and random interrogation. But before she could even give a proper answer, Mutsuki, clearly out of patience, grabbed Fujishiro by the neck, practically choking her as she insisted on knowing Yukito's whereabouts. Once Fujishiro managed to calm her down and heard the full story of Mutsuki's messy encounter with Yukito, it finally clicked why he hadn't shown up to school. Mutsuki admitted the whole thing was her fault, looking surprisingly regretful. Meanwhile, Fujishiro sighed in relief that the drama hadn't spiraled into something worse. If things had escalated any further, it might have gotten so getting rid of someone. Mutsuki pressed Fujishiro once more, asking if she really didn't know where Yukito had gone. Fujishiro shook her head, saying he hadn't reached out to her either, but maybe Yuri could help. The moment Mutsuki heard that name, it hit her. Yukito was Yuri's younger brother. Yumi quickly nudged Mutsuki, insisting they track down Yuri together. Meanwhile, Fujishiro offered to call Yuri over the school broadcast. As the announcement echoed through the halls, Mutsuki's nerves spiked. She could feel the tension crawling up her spine, knowing this mess was only about to get way worse. Her mind replayed Yukito's bitter words, the moment he said he regretted helping her. The weight of it crushed her chest. She realized how badly she had warped Yukito's sense of justice, twisting it into something ugly and unfair. The truth was obvious. Yukito had done nothing wrong. The blame was all hers. And the way things ended up, she'd not only hurt him, she'd betrayed his good intentions. Mutsuki knew if she didn't fix this now, she might never get another chance. If she let this slide, she wouldn't just lose Yukito's trust, she'd lose her own belief in what was right. The moment Yuri heard what happened, she completely lost it and nearly swung a punch at Mutsuki. Fujishiro quickly stepped in, trying to calm her down and suggesting she try calling Yukito since they usually commuted together. But of course, on the one day she needed him close, they hadn't gone to school together. Frustrated, Yuri dialed his number, and luckily he answered. Yukito casually mentioned he was by the sea. That alone sent alarms ringing in Yuri's head. In disbelief, she asked if he was thinking of doing something reckless. Yukito brushed it off, saying he was just looking for something he lost and would head home soon. Still, something felt off. When Yuri asked if he was okay, his reply was unsettling. Out of nowhere, he told her to just wait until she hit high school. After that, she wouldn't have to worry about him anymore. Yuri froze. The pieces started clicking into place and her heart dropped. No way, it couldn't be what she thought. It was way too soon for him to just vanish from her life like that. Desperate, she yelled at him through the phone, begging him to stop, telling him that this wasn't what she had meant. But before she could say more, Yukito ended the call with a simple promise that he'd head home. Afterward, Fujishiro gently checked if Yuri was okay, but she barely acknowledged her. Instead, Yuri just announced that Yukito said he'd be back and they could deal with everything tomorrow. Then, without looking back, she walked toward the door, leaving only one final cold statement behind. She would never forgive Mutsuki. Meanwhile, while everyone else was drowning in anxiety and guilt, Yukito was chilling by the sea, casually snacking on some sweet tarts. It took Yukito about 30 minutes to reach the sea, but once he arrived, he felt a sense of relief. He even managed to grab a small souvenir for himself and someone else. Skipping school made him feel like a true delinquent. Kokonoe Yukito, the resident troublemaker, living up to his reputation. Before heading back home, he figured he might as well return a lost item he'd found nearby. He'd heard that Japan's return rate for lost things hovered around 60%, and it made him wonder if there'd ever be a day when he could reclaim what he'd lost too. At some point, Yukito had lost his sense of goodwill. No matter how much kindness people showed him, he couldn't return it. The warmth he once felt, the emotions of love and attachment, they were all gone. He figured it was better not to get too close to anyone. Otherwise, he'd just end up dragging them down with him. At least, that's the story he kept telling himself. As he glanced down at his phone, he noticed his screen lighting up with notifications. People were looking for him. A lot of people. And he couldn't wrap his head around why anyone would care. Even someone as invisible as him still somehow managed to hurt others. Yukito tilted his head back, eyes on the sky, realizing he'd ended up causing pain yet again. Meanwhile, back at school, Yuri wandered aimlessly through the halls, completely lost in her thoughts after her phone call with Yukito. He still remembered those words she'd said to him when they were kids, and honestly, so did she. The memory still clung to her hands like a stain, and Yukito's face from that day was burned into her mind. He never brought it up, and Yuri lived in fear that anyone might discover the truth. Because that day she had tried to kill her own brother, a sin she could never take back. As a child, Yukito shared an inseparable bond with his older sister Yuri. With their mother constantly busy, Yuri often found herself looking after him. But she never minded because it felt natural and she adored her baby brother. Still, Yuri was just a kid herself, trying to balance love and attention. Her best friend back then, Maki, was an only child, so she frequently joined in on their playtime. Yukito was always part of the fun. But one afternoon, Maki offhandedly remarked that Yukito was so adorable she wished he could be her little brother. That single comment rattled Yuri. Suddenly, it felt like Yukito was stealing Maki away from her, and Maki was taking Yukito for herself. Twisted in a knot of jealousy and possessiveness, Yuri grew resentful, aiming most of her anger at Yukito. To her, he was the thief who took her best friend. Then, on a seemingly normal day, Yukito asked Yuri to play. But instead of agreeing, Yuri, overwhelmed by bitterness, lashed out. She shoved him and screamed for him to disappear. Yukito, blindsided by the outburst, fell from the monkey bars. The betrayal hit him before the ground did. By the time Yuri snapped back to reality, it was too late. Rushing to his side, she found him lying unconscious, his small body bloodied. Panicked, Yuri ran home and confessed everything to their mother. But when they hurried back to the park, Yukito was gone. 6 days later, they found him in a hospital. The police had brought him in, but no one could explain the gap in time. When Yuri and her mom saw him again, exhaustion clung to his pale, innocent face. As soon as he woke, their mother pulled him into a tearful embrace. Yuri could only stare, realizing the full weight of what she'd done. His injuries were severe, and it was all her fault. And then, as if to shatter what little strength she had left, Yukito quietly whispered that he was sorry for not being able to disappear. Yuri froze. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She was the one who should have been apologizing. Yukito was innocent, and he'd done nothing wrong. It wasn't until years later that Yuri finally understood what he'd meant. He hadn't just left the playground that day. He almost left the world. When she told him to disappear, she only meant to push him away, not for him to die. Ever since that moment, Yuri never stopped apologizing, whether out loud or silently in her heart. Every time she looked at him, at the quiet, distant person he became, the guilt returned. But Yukito never once got angry. It was like that emotion had been drained from him. Over time, piece by piece, his emotions faded. The brother she loved slowly withered into someone unrecognizable. Yuri wanted to be punished for what she did. She wanted to cry, to scream, to somehow fix the past. She wished they could start over, that Yukito could look at her and call her his sister the way he used to. But by the time they made it to high school, she realized the truth. Yukito really had disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally. Her words had carved out a part of him she could never get back. But even so, Yuri made herself a promise. No matter what, she'd save him. With her own hands, she'd bring him back. Meanwhile, at school, a furious girl came looking for Yukito. Mihu called Yukito over, who was unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. The next day at school, word spread like wildfire that the student council president was confronting Yukito over in Class B. Naturally, the whole school stampeded over to see the drama unfold. Yukito, meanwhile, found himself face to face with Mutsuki and Yumi, the same girls who just yesterday accused him of preying on an innocent woman. Turns out they were the president and vice president. Breaking the silence, Yumi turned to Mutsuki, asking if she was really going through with her plan. Yukito, on high alert, braced himself for whatever chaos was coming next. Then, out of nowhere, both girls dropped to the floor and bowed deeply, apologizing to him in front of everyone. The crowd was shocked. Phones were out, videos were rolling. Yukito couldn't help but feel like some feudal lord or something. He awkwardly told them to get up, saying their apology scene was way too dramatic. Mutsuki insisted she genuinely wanted to say sorry for what they did, and Yumi thanked him for helping her out. But Yukito wasn't having it. He turned away, saying he was over it. Mutsuki pushed back, saying they couldn't just leave things like this and wanted to make it up to him somehow. However, Yukito simply didn't care about what they had to say. Not wanting to leave things unresolved, Mutsuki suddenly blurted out her solution. She offered to let Yukito hug her. Yep, straight up hug. Bonus points if the goods were as advertised. Yumi, horrified at her friend's wild idea, quickly tried to suggest they treat Yukito to a nice meal instead. But Yukito definitely heard the first offer loud and clear. Now curious, he acted coy, pretending he didn't catch it and asked Mutsuki to repeat herself. Flustered beyond belief, Mutsuki awkwardly confessed it was her first time. Mutsuki told Yukito she would still accept him even if he didn't want to use protection, leaving Yumi completely horrified. Still, Mutsuki confidently claimed she was fine with doing it without any protection at all. Meanwhile, Yukito was just left speechless. On the bright side, at least the vice president seemed like a normal and decent person. Then Mutsuki reassured Yumi that she was fully aware of what she was saying, which honestly made it even worse. She explained that based on her research, this kind of offer would make any high school boy happy. Feeling secondhand embarrassment, Yukito covered Mutsuki's mouth to stop her from rambling. Mutsuki went on to say that she almost made a mistake that could have ruined Yukito's life. Since it was her fault, she felt it wouldn't be fair unless she was willing to risk something just as serious. Out of nowhere, Mutsuki revealed a pair of giant melons and begged Yukito to accept her offer. Some people are just God's favorites. However, Yukito turned her down, telling her that most people wouldn't exactly feel happy if someone came at them like that. Mutsuki admitted it was hard to believe but understood his point. Meanwhile, Yumi quickly pulled Mutsuki's vest down, scolding her and telling her to calm down because she was acting completely out of control. Mutsuki desperately clung to Yukito, saying she still felt the need to apologize. Seeing her like that, Yukito remembered the saying about how it's shameful for a man not to eat well, but honestly, he wasn't hungry. In fact, a normal meal wouldn't satisfy him at all. Wanting to get out of the awkward situation, Yukito suddenly dashed toward the door, claiming he needed to go shopping. Rather than giving in to any temptations, he decided it was better to just escape. Mutsuki tried to follow, but Yukito managed to get away. The next day at school, everyone stared at Yukito as he walked through the halls. Word had spread about what happened with Mutsuki and how she offered to be friends with benefits. People whispered, wondering if they had already done something, while others were impressed by Yukito's supposed charm. Yukito actually enjoyed the attention, now being called the third-year Casanova. But at the same time, he couldn't help but sigh since it sounded pretty cringe when people said it out loud. If his mentality wasn't strong, he knew he'd probably be in serious trouble. He could only sulk, realizing that his ideal student life was slipping further and further away. And that day, things only got worse. Later on, Mihu noticed that Yukito seemed distracted and asked what was bothering him. Yukito explained that he found a letter in his shoe locker, and he suspected it might be a love letter. Instantly, everyone's attention shifted to Yukito, eagerly waiting for him to open it. Before he even checked the letter, Yukito caught sight of Mihu's overly excited face, which annoyed him. Then Mineta asked if it was really a love letter, but Yukito ignored her as he was busy arguing with Mihu, who was literally gossiping about him right next to him. As Yukito tried to dodge Kamishiro and Mineta's questions, the rest of the class started whispering and even tweeting about him, which irritated him the most. Yukito wondered why everyone was suddenly paying so much attention to him. He was supposed to be living a quiet, low-key life, but now it felt like the complete opposite. Mihu then asked what the letter said. Yukito held it up and admitted he wasn't sure, but it felt like trouble. When Mihu read it, the letter asked Yukito to meet someone in the study room. Later, Yukito met Hasamura from Class C. She had gone to the same junior high as him and asked if he remembered her. Yukito honestly didn't, but Hasamura brushed it off and kept talking. She explained that this wasn't technically their first time meeting, but they had never talked like this before. Then she got straight to the point. She wanted Yukito to stay away from Kamishiro. Hasamura was Kamishiro's best friend, and ever since Yukito got involved with her, Kamishiro had become depressed. It was painful to watch, and Hasamura was genuinely worried about her. Yukito asked what exactly she expected him to do, leaving Hasamura a bit speechless. He explained that he never forced Kamishiro to do anything. In fact, he'd already told her multiple times to leave him alone, but she never listened. That's why he was asking for advice now. What else could he do? Hasamura started tearing up, asking if it was really that simple to just give up on Kamishiro. She revealed that Kamishiro had chosen this high school just to follow Yukito, all because she really liked him. After everything, why couldn't he just return her feelings? Yukito should at least understand that much. But Yukito shook his head and told her she was wrong. Smiling a bit, he reassured Hasamura that he'd try again to leave Kamishiro behind for good. Then he left the room, leaving Hasamura desperate to explain that this wasn't what she wanted. Things weren't supposed to turn out like this, but Yukito was determined. This time he was going to make sure Kamishiro understood. Staying apart was for the best, and he'd be clear about it. Yukito thought back to the times he spent with Kamishiro, realizing that those moments were genuinely enjoyable. Maybe he was just overwhelmed when he tried to reject her back then, but now that was all in the past, something he couldn't go back to. The next day, a third-year student named Hasamura introduced himself to the class and asked where Yukito was. Yukito immediately felt uneasy, sensing where this was going. When Yukito identified himself, he asked why Toshiro was looking for him. Toshiro explained that he was the captain of the basketball club. Hearing that, Yukito tried to brush him off by pretending he was someone else and claiming the real Yukito was in the cafeteria. Toshiro, unfazed, told him to stop joking. Toshiro then mentioned that Hayakuma had asked him to invite Yukito to join the basketball team. Yukito was surprised, wondering why Hayakuma was still getting involved even after graduating. After a brief pause, Yukito's expression shifted. He became more serious, telling Toshiro plainly that if he had any intention of joining the team, he would have done so from the very start. To him, throwing himself into club activities felt pointless, just another distraction, another way to avoid facing the reality of his own broken feelings. But despite Yukito's blunt response, Toshiro didn't back off. Instead, he met Yukito's seriousness with determination of his own. He admitted that yes, their team wasn't exactly strong, and realistically, they didn't have much of a chance to win anything big. Still, that didn't change the fact that this was their final year. After putting in 3 years of hard work, Toshiro wanted to give everything he had left in their last tournament. And for that, he needed Yukito's help. He wasn't just offering an invitation, he was asking for Yukito to lend him his strength. Toshiro informed Yukito that the basketball club only had 9 members, meaning he could start immediately if he joined. However, Yukito couldn't help but think about how the team's situation starkly contrasted with the popular manga that had taken the Reiwa era by storm. This wasn't a story about underdogs rising to greatness. Their team was simply small and weak. Just then, Toshiro threw an unexpected question at him, asking if there was someone Yukito wanted to impress by doing well in the tournament. Without hesitation, Yukito dismissed the idea, stating he had no one in mind, because frankly, there was no one like that in his life. To Yukito's surprise, Toshiro suddenly declared that he, on the other hand, did have someone special he wanted to impress and confess to. Realization hit Yukito like a brick. So this was Toshiro's true motive all along. Annoyed by the revelation, Yukito brushed him off, telling him he could do whatever he wanted, but Toshiro wasn't done yet. With an unwavering stare, he pointed at Yukito and issued a challenge. They would settle things on the court. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Yukito. This reckless, hot-blooded idiot was dragging him into an absurd spectacle. And to make matters worse, the entire class had turned their full attention to them. The pressure mounted when Mihu chimed in, urging Yukito to accept the challenge. Soon after, Kamishiro joined in, adding to the pressure, practically demanding that Yukito say yes. The excitement in the room escalated as they even pulled in another student, a boy named Saito, encouraging him to join the team as well. As the classroom buzzed with energy, Yukito suddenly realized something. His own opinion in this matter had become completely irrelevant. It was as if the entire class had collectively decided his fate without him having any say in it. The murmurs and shouts grew louder, and before he could even process what was happening, the students had already begun hyping up a game scheduled for after school. Frustrated and unwilling to be swept up in their enthusiasm, Yukito made one thing clear. They could go ahead and play without him. Despite his refusal, word of the impending basketball showdown spread rapidly throughout the school, fueling even more excitement. Soon, the news reached the ears of the girls in Yuri's class. They eagerly gossiped about it, marveling at how Yukito had once made the student council president bow to him, and was now taking on the basketball team captain. One of the girls found the whole situation ridiculous, while another was still reeling from the idea that Mutsuki had ever bowed before Yukito. As the chatter continued, Yuri, growing increasingly irritated, snapped at them for treating it like some sort of entertainment spectacle. She reminded them that this wasn't a joke, nor was it something to be casually discussed like idle gossip. The more she thought about the upcoming match, the more frustrated she became. It stirred up emotions she had long suppressed, and before she knew it, she was storming out of the classroom in an attempt to clear her head. As she made her way to the vending machine, she couldn't stop herself from recalling how devoted Yukito had been to basketball back in middle school. Back then, she had found him incredibly cool, and now, she couldn't help but wonder, would she ever get to see him play like that again? Meanwhile, back on the court, Yukito was just trying to stretch without losing his will to live. But the whispers around him made it impossible to ignore the growing rumors. The students speculated that he had slept with Mutsuki and was now wagering a girl over a basketball match. Before he knew it, he had earned the reputation of the school's ultimate playboy, its very own Casanova. The rumors are evolving faster than Pokemon. The absurdity of it all made Yukito sigh in frustration. He reasoned that these students were likely just latching onto any drama to break the monotony of their lives. Yet, despite wanting to remain a bystander, he had somehow ended up in the spotlight. Groaning at the situation, he wished he could just go home. But whether he liked it or not, he had to face the challenge ahead. The match was set. A 3-on-3 game against 3 regular members of the basketball team. The format was simple. An alternating offense-defense system split into 2 5-minute periods totaling 10 minutes. Before the match even began, Toshiro with a devilish grin laid down the stakes. If Yukito's team lost, they would have to join the basketball club. Mihu readily agreed, much to Yukito's horror. Internally, Yukito screamed at Mihu for making decisions on his behalf, especially since Toshiro wasn't even that big of a deal on the basketball team. Annoyed, Yukito decided to set his own terms. If his team won, the basketball club had to disband. The moment the words left his mouth, Toshiro and his teammates dramatically collapsed onto the floor, wailing that his demand was way too extreme. Yukito found their reaction ridiculous. Why would third years be so quick to assume they would lose to a first year in the first place? Yukito had no idea if Mihu or Saito were any good at basketball. Not that it mattered. He had no real motivation to play anyway, and he simply didn't care. While Yukito sulked at the thought, Mihu and Saito were hyping themselves up, brimming with excitement. Mihu in particular seemed prepared to accept defeat, knowing they were up against seniors. However, just as he was getting ready to accept the inevitable, a sinister grin spread across Mihu's face. With a sudden burst of confidence, he declared that they would definitely win. Something tells me he's about to break Toshiro's neck. Yukito, watching this unexpected shift in Mihu's demeanor, felt a shiver crawl up his spine. As the game kicked off, Yukito found himself at the center of it all. He prepared for his first shot, and for a brief moment a realization washed over him. Never once had he thought he would play basketball at school again. The sport had once been his escape, something he did for himself. It was never for his teammates or the sake of camaraderie, and that was why he always practiced alone. But then, in the summer of his second year, everything changed. Someone had entered his life. Someone who refused to leave him alone, who persistently spoke to him, who saw him in ways others hadn't. That person was none other than Shiori Kamishiro, and she had confessed to him. That is the end of Chapter 9. Please read the pinned comment about the next part.